Hi there, and welcome to Structures, the show about Toronto's history and Toronto's architecture. I'm your host, Angus Skeen, and on this episode, we're going to have a look at a bunch of stuff, but we're going to start out with Sunlight Baseball Park. Now, you know the names of the great baseball players in Toronto, Alomar, Joe Carter, Angus Skeen, but, some of the names we've forgotten really had their start at a park that doesn't exist anymore.
There were a number of places where people used to gather to cheer for their favorite team. Places where the cries of peanut vendors could be heard. Places that were forgotten chapters in Toronto's baseball history until now. And the place where it all started was Sunlight Baseball Park.
The park was built by a group of Toronto businessmen who liked the idea of having a professional baseball franchise in the city. In the early 1880s, they were approached by Albert Goodwill Spaulding, owner of the Spaulding Sporting Goods empire, to join a new league he was founding called the National Baseball League.
Instead, they opted to join a Canadian league because they feared Americans would dominate the business. That league eventually became the International League and included teams from Hamilton, Syracuse, and Buffalo. The Blue Jays farm team currently plays in the International League.
Sunlight Baseball Park was built in 1884 for $7,000 near the southwest corner of Queen and Broadview, not far from the Don River. Originally called the Toronto Baseball Grounds, it was also known as the Park Across the Don and ultimately Sunlight Park when William Lever built his Sunlight Soap Company directly behind the outfield fence. The park was built on that location because it was close enough to the city for people to travel to, but far enough that it wouldn't disrupt city life.
Sunlight Park was for Torontonians in 1887 what the Sky Dome is for Torontonians today. It was a focal point for professional sports in Toronto. It was the place where baseball really got its first roots in the city. We're standing on the site of the first home plate in Toronto, which ironically was also the site of the first home in Toronto that belonged to the Scatting Cabin.
The Torontos, later renamed the Toronto Maple Leafs, started playing at Sunlight Park in 1885. The grandstand was built out of wood, had overhead roofing, and seated 2,200 people. After the success of the 1887 season, about 500 extra seats were added in the right field. During the games, fans were allowed to stand in the outfield or foul zones. For the championship game in 1887, the fans were 10 to 15 feet deep in some places. On September 17, 1887, Toronto won its first professional sports championship on the arm of a pitcher named Ned Cannonball Crane. He was considered a legend because he was able to throw a baseball farther than 400 feet. He had a batting average of .443 and won 33 games. Admission to the park was 25 cents, which you could buy in advance at Nordheimer's Piano Studio on Yonge Street. For an extra 20 cents, you would get a seat with a leather cushion that was under the covered stands.
The stadium had two entry points. One entrance was off Broadview. The other was a small, narrow street running south of Queen called Baseball Place. The street was covered over in 1984 to make way for a car dealership.
A 14-foot-high fence surrounded the outfield and featured 3 sliding doors on the south, east, and west sides for players to retrieve lost balls. Sunlight Park Road runs along where part of the outfield fence once stood. One unique feature of the stadium was the direction it faced.
The stadium was on a north-south axis. The north-south axis meant that a lot of hitters, especially early in the season and late in the season, would be looking into the sun. Most baseball parks are aligned on an east-southeast sort of perspective.
In 1896, the stadium was put out of use mainly because of the industry on the Don, including the Sunlight Soap Works, which gave off an odor. That year, the team moved to Diamond Park, which is the current site of Lamport Stadium. However, the team only stayed there for about 5 years because it smelled even worse due to the nearby stockyards. The team then moved to the lacrosse grounds at Hanlon's Point. It was in use until fire destroyed it in 1904. 2 more stadiums were built after that. The second one also burned down, and the third one closed and was eventually torn down when it was considered too small for the large crowds.
However, history was made at the third stadium. During the 1914 season, Babe Ruth, who was playing for the Providence Reds, hit his first professional home run.
In 1926, the team moved to the new Maple Leaf Stadium. Located at the intersection of Fleet and Bathurst, it was used until 1967 when the franchise moved to Louisville. This was the end of professional baseball in Toronto until 1976 when the Blue Jays came to town. The stadium at Sunlight Park was eventually torn down. The empty grounds have been used by various local teams to practice and play on. The land has also been used as a lumber yard and a horse racetrack, and there's currently a drug warehouse on the corner of the property. But for the most part, the grounds have sat vacant.
Sunlight Park was a place where baseball found its home and marked the beginning of baseball's future in the city. It was Toronto's first Field of Dreams.
Coming up, the lost buildings of Exhibition Place and James Austin.